reform and how that works, how that is working or not working for people, and what all the governor has done over the last couple of years in the state of New York for criminal justice reform. So he's congratulating himself for the success of it. You may have seen in the local news here that there's one particular notorious individual who's been arrested like something ridiculous, like 30 times since March for all kinds of criminal mischief and threatening people with a knife and things like that. And so we may say, well, that doesn't seem like criminal justice reform is working out very well. So the governor has a different take on that. So I thought we would just do an update and see how it's going, what the reform laws are, not just the most recent ones, but since 2018, and talk about the differences of then and now. So Governor Cuomo on his website is saying that the reforms to criminal justice system have resulted in a drastic result in mass incarceration, and that's true. If the judges can't set bail for a misdemeanor, then the fact that someone may not have money to make bail means that they aren't sitting in jail, losing their job, being away from their families, waiting for the criminal justice system, which occasionally grinds very slowly, to work. And then a lot of times, when people are in a jail for a misdemeanor, they have a job, but their jobs aren't being held for them. They are, they're not there. Their boss needs someone to work, at least in former times before COVID-19 pandemic. But even now, if someone with the misdemeanor were to be in jail and need to go to their job because they're an essential worker, very likely, especially now, an essential worker would be replaced fairly quickly because they're essential, right? So we don't have that issue now because people who are charged with misdemeanors are being given appearance tickets and then being allowed to come back to court on another day. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen. So you give somebody who has an appearance ticket, you tell them to come back to court on another day. And even in ordinary times when the court is actually open and they can come back on another day, they don't always do that because they incorrectly think they don't have to because they're no bail set, and the criminal justice reform has lost its teeth as far as putting people in jail without a hearing or without a trial. But the fact is that if it were not for the pandemic, a lot of these cases would have gone to a hearing or trial already with or without the person there. That is something that a lot of times people don't realize, that the courts can actually have a trial without you there if you don't show up. If you've been warned of the court date and you do not appear for your court date, and that court date is a trial, the judge can go ahead and pick a jury with the defense attorney and the prosecutor and go ahead and have a trial without you. And then if you have a public defender, generally speaking, if you're not showing up for court, you're probably not hiring a private attorney. So your public defender will be there really unable to defend you because they don't have you sitting there next to them telling them what really is going on. Even if you've met with them beforehand, you may find out that you don't know everything that the police have, or that the police are ready to present against you, or that someone is going to testify and say is true that may not be true. And if you're not there to answer it, then you're going to get convicted anyway, and a warrant will be issued for your arrest, and then you'll get thrown to jail or prison, presumably, with even less process, because when you don't show up for your court dates and you don't show up for your trial, and if you're prison eligible, and almost everything in New York State is eligible for at least a little bit of jail time, whether it's jail or prison, and there's a technical difference, but if they lock you up, the idea is that probably a judge is probably going to be more likely to lock you up if you don't show up, because they're not going to expect you to follow any probation or any other sentence that the judge may render short of being locked up because you didn't show up to court. And if people don't show up to court, how can you be confident that they're going to do anything else the judge says to do? So in the short term, it's reducing mass incarceration, but I wonder after the COVID-19 pandemic lifts, if we are going to see more incarceration rather than less incarceration because of the people doing what in the court's eyes is behaving badly and not showing up for court, and then not taking whatever lesser punishment they may have gotten for a misdemeanor, but instead are more severely punished because they didn't show up for court. Their attorney was unable to defend them without their assistance in court, and then they don't have the ability to defend themselves. And so some people, they're going to want to appeal and say, well, I didn't get my trial. And the fact is, you got your trial, you just weren't there for it. Another thing that Governor Cuomo is congratulating himself for, and maybe he deserves congratulations, maybe he doesn't, but it's since Governor Cuomo took office in 2011, the current statistic is the prison population has decreased by nearly 12,000 people, which is a 21% reduction. And the current population is at its lowest level in 30 years, and New York now leads the nation with the lowest imprisonment rate of any large state. At the same time, New York State has remained the safest large state in the country, the website goes on to say. And the reason why the governor says that it's the safest large state in the country is because we have the lowest crime rate now of any large state in the country. And you might want to say, well, that's awesome. We're not locking up criminals and we have the lowest crime rate. Woohoo! Something's going right. And it may be that something's going right, but it's been my experience as an attorney here in the southern tier of New York that people simply aren't getting arrested for things the way they used to be. So along with the criminal justice reform, the bail reform, has come a whole bunch of new requirements on the district attorney. Now, that's long overdue because the district attorneys in New York State before didn't have to give you any information hardly before trial. And now they have to give you a whole bunch. They have to give it to you within 15 days. So we're going to take a break here, and we're going to come back afterwards and talk about the implications of that.
All right. So one thing I wanted to mention, the last couple times we ran over at the 8:30, yeah, I'm sorry, 9:30. I've got an interview right at 9:30, so I'll text you as early as I can to just make sure that we get done at 9:30.
Okay.
Because I have to run into the other room, and I don't want to miss the interview. So.
No, of course not. Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for watching. I see your message, Rich. I will call you after.
All right, we've got 30 seconds.
Okay.
All right, the rejoin is just starting. I'll let you know when it's time to go.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
And we're back with Law Talk. Thank you for being here this morning. And we're talking about criminal justice reform and bail reform. Now, one of the things that most of the attorneys were really glad about, those of us who defend people who are accused of crimes, was the discovery reform, what they call. And many people who were not familiar with the criminal justice system, who were arrested for things that are crimes that go across the spectrum. So, for example, DWI doesn't really seem to matter your socioeconomic status. A lot of people are from all kinds of social classes and backgrounds that get arrested for DWI, and other crimes that are across the spectrum. They were often surprised to find out how little the district attorney had to give you before your trial, how little information they had to give you. And so a lot of the time you didn't have any idea who the witnesses against you were, what they said, and in many, many cases, not even specifically what you supposedly did or where you did it. Now, in the case of DWI, that wasn't such a mystery because, generally speaking, you got pulled over by the police and you knew exactly where and when that happened. But in other cases, for example, when somebody allegedly sold a drug, they would say, well, in March of 2019, in the city of, just say Bath, whatever. March of 2019 in the city of Bath, you sold a quantity of X drug And that was it. That would be all the information you'd have. And my client and I would be talking, and I'd say, well, were you present for a drug sale? Do you have any idea what they're talking about? And very often, they didn't have any idea what they were actually accused of on what day, what time, whatever. And so we really couldn't prepare a defense at all. And then we'd get to trial, if we did go to trial, if we didn't plead guilty to a lesser charge, then, which I really hate to do when you don't even know what your client supposedly did and they're telling you they didn't do anything like that. You don't want to plead guilty to a lesser charge. So you get to trial, and then you'd find out something like, in one case, my client was present for a drug deal, and it went down in front of her. And what she did was apparently the person who was selling the drugs owed her boyfriend money. So when the person put the money down on the table, she picked it up because that person owed her boyfriend money. And she left with the money, and the drugs did change hands, and she was considered to be a part of that deal because she touched the money and walked off with it. So she was part of that drug deal, whether she meant to be part of a drug deal or not. Now, nowadays, if they are more specific about what happens, and they have to be nowadays more specific about what happens, we could have prepared a better defense saying, what was really going on, had witnesses for that, done things differently because we would have known more. So that is what the discovery reform is meant to address, and so it's great that it does that. That is something that should have happened a long time ago, to help people prepare their defenses so that they would know what it is that they're accused of and when they're accused of doing it. The problem with criminal justice reform, and even defense attorneys generally agree this is a problem, is that the prosecution is supposed to get all of the evidence together in 15 days. And if they don't get all the evidence together and delivered to you within 15 days, then there are various motions you can make to get the crime thrown out, essentially. So it's in many cases impossible to get everything together, to get ready for a trial, basically, and turn all the evidence over for that trial in 15 days when they've got a whole bunch of cases that they are prosecuting. They just don't have the manpower for that sort of thing. So what's happening now is that they are prosecuting fewer misdemeanors. So they're giving a lot more warnings out. If you look at the police blotters now in the newspaper or online, you'll see, it says Officer so-and-so stopped someone, talked to them, gave them a warning. A whole lot more than you used to see warnings given out. They used to just give tickets out or charge people, but now they're giving warnings a lot. And it appears to me that what's happening is that the arrest rate has gone down, and so the criminal rate, the statistics for criminal rates have gone down, so it looks like New York has become a safer place. So when Governor Cuomo says, oh, this is great, we've reduced the prison population and the crime rates dropped, so look, we haven't increased the crimes that are happening, we've actually decreased them, what we're doing works, and critics go home. What they're not looking at is how many warnings are being given versus arrests, and whether or not misdemeanors are actually happening and not being prosecuted, because the police and the district attorney's office have to be pickier, really, about what kind of things they go ahead and prosecute, because they just aren't going to be able to get the 15-day discovery deadline met in the number of cases that they used to arrest people for. Now, some people would think, oh, that's great, so they're not arresting for, maybe relatively minor things that they don't need to arrest for, and I'm sure that's true, but it's also true that, as I said, there was, at the beginning of the show, there's at least one notorious person in the city of Corning who has been arrested, I believe they said in the paper 30 times since March. And they're all for misdemeanors. So this person keeps getting let out because bail can't be set for a misdemeanor, even when they're caught red-handed, even when you're very certain that this is the same person who did the same thing a day or two ago. And so they're continuing letting this person out. And you might say, well, that's all right, criminal justice, it's going to move forward anyway, but the courts have been closed. The town and city courts, which is the court that not only starts the prosecution of misdemeanors but finishes the prosecution of misdemeanors, are closed. So they're arraigning people in order to not set bail at a central court in the counties, but then they're letting them go, and they get a court date whenever the courts reopen. And even now, we don't know when that's going to be. So in the current situation, what you have is you can't set bail for a misdemeanor. So the person who commits a misdemeanor goes free, at least immediately. And then you can't take them to court to continue the case against them. So when you have a misdemeanor, someone's free on bail, they can't get their speedy trial in speedy trial time because the courts are closed, or at least it's certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has eaten into a lot of what is considered a reasonable speedy trial crime. The police and the prosecutors are correct in not bothering to arrest a lot of people. I mean, A, you can't get the discovery to the attorneys in time. B, you may not be able to prosecute them in time. So if you're not able to get the discovery to the defense attorneys in time, and therefore you have to, the case goes away because you didn't do your discovery appropriately, or they are not going to be tried in time for their speedy trial, so the case goes away because of the due process violation, why bother to arrest people for misdemeanors? So when the governor says, oh, great, success, crime rate's going down, you have to look a little deeper than that, and it's time for another break. All right, was that all right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll text you. I'll give you more text on this last one.
Okay, all right. All right, so we have to take a hard break. Sometimes I run a few seconds over, sometimes a few seconds before, sometimes a few seconds over on the last segment, but Frank has an interview lined up right at 9:30, so he's got to kind of run out the door in the studio, because he's in the studio, I'm here, I'm calling him on the phone, and he's got to go run to a different studio and do that interview right away. So if we cut off, so I get a question, how do New York citizens reverse ridiculous laws? Well, you got to write to your legislature. So we can cover that too. But I mean, unfortunately, we don't as citizens get to write laws ourselves. We only get to elect people who write laws. So we're not going to be able to do anything about it. Like in California, if they get enough petitions together, they can change the law. But I don't think that applies to criminal justice reform. I have to look into that. I know that we don't have anything like Proposition 13 like California does. So Frank is going to let me know. Part of the problem, Kelly, is too that we're in the middle of the COVID-19, so like all the rules are out the window, and we don't know when they're going to go back into force. How we doing, Frank?
Good. You got about 30 seconds.
Okay. Yeah, COVID's made it worse.
Rejoin is just about to start, and I'll let you know when it's over.
Okay. You're welcome.
All right, so it started, and go ahead.
Welcome back to Law Talk. We're talking about criminal justice reform in New York State, and the final sort of leg of the major overall. We'll take a deeper dive in a couple of minutes, but the next one is speedy trial reform. And the legislation addressing speedy trial reform was to address excessively long pretrial periods to reduce the backlog of criminal cases by requiring courts to increase accountability, reducing unnecessary delays, and ensuring all parties are prepared for trial. So there's a couple of things to that. One, that is true. There was often a very long delay between the arrest and a trial. And certainly if someone was sitting in jail because they couldn't make bail, that was unfair, because if people had money could bail out on certain crimes, and people who didn't have money simply couldn't. You know, it wouldn't matter what you set the bail at. You know, if you're asking for $500, you might as well be asking for $5 million, because they didn't have $500. And so therefore they were sitting in jail sometimes for many, many, many months waiting for their trial to happen. So at the same time that they did the bail reform and saying, all right, that's not going to happen for misdemeanors anymore, they did speedy trial reform. So now you have the fact that the prosecutors have to get the discovery to you in 15 days. You've got no bail. And then if the trial doesn't take place within a certain period of time, depending on the crime, that's just yet one more reason why the criminal charges could be thrown out, and yet one more reason why the prosecutors are not necessarily, and the police are not necessarily bothering to even arrest people, because there's all these steps or things that can go wrong, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. But the fact is, these implemented rules couldn't be followed even before COVID-19. And now that you've got the courts closed, you can't have a speedy trial. In fact, I have been told unofficially, completely unofficially, that as far as in-person trials go, we may not be having them again until 2021. And if we have other kinds of trials, we may have trials by Skype, which is what the court system is using now to meet with attorneys and litigants. In some counties, just attorneys. In Chemung County, they're allowing litigants to come in on the Skype meetings too. But in Steuben County, so far, they're not. So, and they're talking about having trials by Skype. Now, I can see the ability to have a trial by Skype in some ways in a non-jury trial. But when you have a jury trial, what happens first is that you've got a room full of jurors, and then you go through them and you try to pick out jurors that are going to be fair and impartial for your case. And you need a large jury pool to do that. And I just don't see, because of the way the process is done, the judge announces, so say you've got 50 or 60 people in the room, and the judge announces what the rules are and how to follow them, and the jury watches a movie beforehand that teaches them how to be jurors and what their responsibilities are, and so they watch that all at once. Okay, you could do that online. But then the judge reads something to the people and reads it out loud, because not everyone can read and write in the English language who is chosen for a jury can do that very well. And I'm not just talking about people who are not here since they were born, but I'm talking about even people who were here since they were born. Some people just don't read and write very well. So you can't just throw it at them and say, here, read this. And they have a right and a responsibility to be jurors as well. So that doesn't always work well if you're going to try to get them to read something. So the judge reads it to them. So again, you're reading to 50 or 60 people. So could you have that on the phone in some sort of massive phone conference or massive Skype conference? Yes. But in the courtroom, you can tell if people are paying attention. If you're not, if you're not there with them, you don't know if they've got, their favorite music in their earbuds, or, if they're on by phone and not by Skype, you can't even see them. You don't even know if they're in the room. So conducting a trial by Skype is going to be very, very difficult. So the speedy trial reform, it's going to be interesting to see how COVID-19 impacts that, especially for misdemeanors, because there isn't any way to go ahead and have that trial when the courts are closed. The last thing about the absolute impossibility of moving forward with criminal prosecutions is that Governor Cuomo just declared that the 6th grand jury term this year is postponed until further notice. So why do we care? Well, a grand jury is a necessary part of the process to charge someone to proceed with a felony. A person can be arrested for a felony, but then they have to have a grand jury determine whether or not there's enough evidence to charge them with a felony within a certain number of days. And if that doesn't happen, then their attorney can make a motion and get the felony charges dismissed because the failure of speedy prosecution for the felony and because they weren't indicted within a certain number of days. So now the governor has made it literally impossible to move forward even with felony prosecutions. So you already can't move forward with misdemeanor prosecutions because the town and county courts are closed, and the centralized courts that they have, the centralized courts, aren't going to be doing those trials, at least not right now. That's not their plan. They're planning to reopen the courts at some point. Who knows when? So they can't proceed for all the reasons we discussed already with misdemeanor cases. But now that the governor has postponed indefinitely the grand jury terms, because obviously they don't want to get a bunch of people together, as the way I described just now, how to choose a jury. For the grand jury, same thing. You have to get a bunch of people in a room. You have to make sure they can be impartial, and they can't do that. And then you have, instead of a jury of 12, the grand jurors, 20 people, I believe it is. Check. But in any event, a lot of people in a room together and listening to the evidence. Grand juries are secret, so you can't necessarily do this over Skype or over the phone. So the prosecutions, not only for misdemeanors, are at a halt, but for felonies as well. And what does this mean? Well, it means probably people are going to be having felony charges against them dropped, because the governor has said you cannot have a grand jury. So all over New York State, you can't have a grand jury. how are you going to move forward? I mean, these are due process rights that people have when they're accused of a crime. So it doesn't say in the Constitution of New York State or of the United States you have these rights unless there's a pandemic or a public emergency. That's not how it works. You have those rights, and the government is supposed to just kind of figure it out. So we're running out of time here, but and we have 1 minute. So the last thing I'm going to talk about is the age of criminal responsibility was raised to 18 years old. And so before, way back in the day, that used to be the rule. So gangs were using kids, 15, 16, 17-year-olds commit crimes because they couldn't be held criminally responsible. We're back in that boat. They changed it. It used to be that you could go from 16 on, you could go ahead and prosecute someone as an adult, and then we wound up with a whole bunch of kids in prison for things that maybe they shouldn't have been in prison for. It's a mess. But I have to go, and that's going to be the end of the show for this week because Frank has got a hard stop at 9:30. So thank you for being here, and we'll see you next week.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Frank. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.
All right, everybody. I don't mean to sound all doom and gloom, but I mean the criminal justice system is completely broken. So if you're on Facebook, you're hearing a little more than the people on the radio show did. The criminal justice system is completely broken down in New York State, and not only that, so has the family court system. And you will read, online and in the court system, oh, we're open for all essential things. I'm telling you, I have been trying to file essential things and get the essential things done. So the difference between what the state considers essential and what my clients consider essential are sometimes vastly different. They're working on it. They're working as hard as they can. But the fact is, for example, in Steuben County, there are 3 full-time judges, and that's not enough. Okay, so sometimes they have the city court judges come in and help out, which is legal. And so now, with COVID-19, they're having 1 judge a week come in, and that 1 judge a week is the only judge in the courtroom, so the judges aren't like cross-contaminating each other and they're sanitizing in between. They're different courtrooms, so they could each, in theory, stay in their own courtroom and have it be okay, but that's not what they're doing. And then, so you have 1 judge a week, and you can't actually go into the courthouse to do anything, so we're all getting together by Skype if we can. And there are technical difficulties because living in a rural area, you don't always have good cell phone service and good Skype service. So try to get, child support, for example. If a couple is breaking up during COVID-19, which, let's face it, stuck in the house together, if things weren't good before, they're probably not good now. So try to get somebody child support or spousal support or anything else. And part of the problem for this has been, and this has been fixed now, we can now file things electronically, but for a while there, more than a month, we couldn't file anything. And so child support went back to the date of commencement of filing, but you couldn't file. So you were just not going to get your child support for that month. They haven't changed rules. They haven't fixed that at all. And I think most attorneys, we've remained pretty quiet about, the many difficulties that we're having with the COVID-19 pandemic, because after all, people are dying. And so maybe that is more important than all the difficulties that we're having with the criminal justice system. But it's been going on long enough. They need to figure it out. They need to just figure it out somehow. So that's it. That's it for Law Talk. We'll see you all next week. Bye.